So today we're going to discuss some Civil War strengths and strategies on both the Confederate and the Union side. Well, let's begin with the Union strengths. Now, if you looked at who is producing the most in terms of industry, it would have definitely been the North or the Union. They had probably roughly about 90% of the factories that were in northern states. And with this, they were able to produce all the items that were needed for war, whether it be guns and ammunition, things like that. But anything that could support the war, they could actually manufacture it themselves. Another big thing that the Union had going for them was they had a much larger population up in the North. It's estimated there are about 22 million people living in the North versus about 9 million living in the South, of which about 3.5 million of those would be slaves. But the population, the reason why that was so important is because they had greater resources to draw upon, and especially in maintaining an army and recruiting. Another big strength that the Union had was the fact that most of the Navy and also the naval shipyards were also located in the North. During this time, the railroad became a major factor in winning the war. Now, the Union had about double the railroad mileage that the South had, and that meant that they could get their troops and their supplies, to the battlefront much more quickly than the South could. And finally, probably one of the biggest strengths that the Union had was the fact that they had Abraham Lincoln. And he ended up turning out to be quite a remarkable leader because of his ability to juggle a lot of different things at the same time. And so he was sort of like the perfect person, for the job at the time. Well, all of these different things combined led to a very remarkable set of Union strengths. I forgot to put in Abraham Lincoln here. Thomas the Tank Engine just wanted to dominate there. So just pretend that he is Abraham Lincoln. I didn't forget about you, Abe, so don't get upset. Now, in terms of strategy, you don't want to go into war without having a strategy to win. Now, the thing that they came up with for the Union was called the Anaconda Plan. And as you can see kind of why it's called an anaconda, because what the plan was to use the Navy, which was one of their advantages, and they were going to use the Navy to blockade the South all along this area here, and then eventually take over the Mississippi River. So you see the head of the snake is getting ready to attack the Mississippi River. They thought that by doing so, they could surround the South, and then they could kind of move inward and strangle the Southerners and strangle their economy and basically strangle them into submission. And so that's why they call it the Anaconda Plan. Now, the only problem with the Anaconda Plan was that it was going to take a very long time to accomplish. As you can see, this is not just going to occur, over the space of a few weeks. It was going to take years in order to be successful. So, and this was at a time when they thought that they were hoping that the Civil War was only going to last 90 days. And so when this plan was presented, people were kind of concerned because this is definitely not a 2-week or 2-month plan. So it would be successful, but they needed the time in order to accomplish it. So let's take a moment to discuss the Confederate strengths. Now, while the Union did have their own set of strengths, the Confederates also had theirs. And probably the greatest one was the fact that they did have better generals. Namely, this guy right here, this is Robert E. Lee. And he was widely respected both in the North and the South. And before the war even broke out, Robert E. Lee was asked by the Union Army to head up the Union Army. But he turned them down because whenever Virginia seceded from the Union, he claimed that he could never raise a hand in anger against his home state. And so that's how he ended up being part of the Confederacy. Now, there were others that were, just as well known and just as gifted as he was. Thomas Stonewall Jackson is just one of them, and we'll talk about him a little bit later in class. But overall, they did have better generals leading their armies, and that was probably one of their greatest strengths. Well, another strength that the Confederates had is that they actually had the home field advantage, and they were fighting on their own land, and so they had greater access to supplies than the North did. Now, the Northerners, of course, the Northern soldiers had to move all the way down south, and they had to forage and try to find their own supplies as they went along. Of course, the Confederacy had their own strategies. And they're centered, of course, around their main cash crop, which was cotton. And their strategy was referred to as King Cotton because what they had planned to do was, since they were the world's dominant supplier of cotton, what they wanted to do is to withhold the cotton from the European market and sort of force European nations to basically join the Confederacy in support of them. Now, the plan sort of backfired for the Confederacy because, throughout the years, the European nation has sort of stockpiled their cotton supplies. It's like whenever your parents give you money, they tell you to always put some aside. Well, the European nations had actually been stockpiling cotton. So whenever the Confederacy sort of made this threat and said, we're not going to sell you cotton until you join us, the European nations kind of looked at them and said, okay, fine. We've got enough to last us for several years, so, keep your cotton, and we'll just use the cotton that we have stockpiled. Well, with King Cotton utterly failing, they decided to switch strategies. And it was really all about, creating time and stretching out the war for as long as it possibly could, because the hope is that the Northerners would just get tired of fighting the war and eventually just give up and allow them to be their own country. Now, for discussion next time, what I would like to ask you to all think about is which of the strategies do you think was most effective? And also, since the Confederates were fighting on their own land, we did talk about it being an advantage, but also how could it be a major disadvantage fighting on your own land? So be ready to discuss that next time we meet.